Good evening, and welcome to this webinar sponsored by the City of Los Angeles Department of Cannabis Regulation, Business, Licensing, and Compliance, BLC, Technical Assistance Program. My name is Mario Salazar with the Social Equity Program. BLC programming is designed to assist social equity applicants in the City of Los Angeles as they work to obtain a commercial cannabis license and operate a successful cannabis business. This final installment of our 2024 webinar series focuses on management service agreements. Before we get started, let's take a moment to review some housekeeping rules. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and can be viewed only on DCR's Learning Management System after the editing process. You will be muted with cameras off for the duration of the webinar. This means that your camera and audio functions will not be available to you during the session. However, you will be able to see and hear all the panelists. There's an open chat box where you can interact with one another for networking or comment on the information. Please use caution when sharing personal information in a public forum. Please ask questions about tonight's subject matter in the Q&A box. We are gathering and responding to your questions throughout the presentation, and we'll have a Q&A session where you will also get responses in the last portion of tonight's webinar. You are encouraged to utilize the Q&A box at the bottom pane of your Zoom screen. If you use the Q&A box for questions, everyone will be able to see the questions when they're answered. Finally, please note that tonight's content was not created by the Department of Cannabis Regulation or the City of Los Angeles and is for informational purposes only. This information is subject to change and does not replace or supersede the Los Angeles Municipal Code, nor constitute legal advice. If you have specific questions outside of tonight's topic, please call 213-978-0738 during business hours, Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., to speak to a DCR representative. Without further ado, please welcome tonight's presenter, Mr. Zachary Knox. Mr. Knox has been practicing law in the cannabis industry for 12 years. He is a co-founder and the managing partner of the Knox and Ross Law Group. Mr. Knox is intimately familiar with the California cannabis industry and is nationally recognized as an expert in the field of cannabis law and regulation. Mr. Knox previously served on the City of Oakland's Cannabis Regulatory Commission, and his firm, the Knox and Ross Law Group, has been the contract legal services provider for several of the cannabis technical assistance programs across California, as well as in other states. Welcome, Zachary.
Thank you, Mario, for that warm introduction. And good to see everyone again. Happy to be back working with the DCR and sharing some very important information with you. Let's get right into it. Tonight, we're going to be talking about management service agreements. And what I hope to accomplish tonight is to give everyone on this webinar a baseline understanding of management service agreements, how they're implemented, and how to mitigate any risk associated with entering into a management service agreement. So let's dive in. So management service agreements, they've emerged as critical tools in modern business operations, particularly in the regulated cannabis market, which is why we're all here tonight. They can allow companies to access expertise, optimize operations, and maintain regulatory compliance while focusing on their core competencies. This presentation will provide a thorough examination of MSAs, their implementation, and risk management strategies across the cannabis industry. So let's dive in. This is what we're going to cover tonight. What are management service agreements? How do we understand them? How are they implemented? What are some of the critical provisions and negotiation points that we want to think about as we're considering an MSA? What are the risk factors associated with entering into the MSA, and how do we prevent some of the abuse that goes on in the industry? And then we'll conclude with some key takeaways and best practices. So what are MSAs? If you've been in this industry for a minute and you've entertained opportunities from investors to partner with you, chances are you may have been asked about entering into an MSA. what an MSA is, or a management service agreement, it is a legal contract between a provider of management services and the recipient business. Okay. It provides a framework for outsourcing managerial and administrative functions. It can separate ownership from operational control. And it's a mechanism for accessing expertise without a business needing to having to rely on direct employment. So I think it benefits everyone's understanding if we get an idea of where MSAs came from and how they found themselves within the cannabis industry. Well, MSAs originated in the healthcare industry as management service organizations started reaching out to smaller health practitioners. Major hospital systems, for example, have their own administration, their own management, and never had to rely on the outsourcing of management services. But you can imagine smaller operators, smaller clinics, smaller health practitioners oftentimes found that the doctors themselves were having to perform those functions and not always doing it very well. Um, they would much rather focus on the practice of medicine, which is their core competency, and let somebody else worry about the administrative burden of their clinical practice or the managerial burden of their clinical practice. Originally, they would have to go out and hire their own staff, but there are challenges around making direct hires. And so this is where management service organizations sort of came into development. They had expertise in that space. They knew that they could step in and deliver administrative support as well as managerial support. And doctors were very thankful of that because they could go back to focusing on medicine and essentially outsource the rest of their practice. And outsourcing is very common in a lot of industries. You might outsource your HR, you might outsource your payroll. Oftentimes, you're outsourcing your accounting to an outside accountant, a CPA. So, this model of outsourcing is nothing new. But with the management service organizations, all of a sudden you were able to outsource everything with regard to your business except the core competency that you wanted to focus on. And in the original case, that was medicine. Um, it since has expanded into other sectors. There were other professionals that felt that they could benefit from this model, allowing them to focus on their core competency and allow somebody else to focus on the administrative and managerial burdens of their business. Um, as such, and I may have mentioned this just now, the growth of MSAs was driven by this desire to focus on core competencies and allow somebody else who was better suited to deal with administrative and managerial tasks to take on that role. And ever since we have seen the advent of the regulated cannabis market, that has also been true here in this industry. If you can imagine, there are cultivators who want to focus on cultivating their plants and manufacturers who want to focus on producing the best products and don't necessarily have the skill set or the desire to step deep into administrative tasks or managerial tasks. Um, so there is some context there, but for better or worse, MSAs are here in this industry now. It's something that we have to consider, something that's going to be presented to you. So what we're hoping to do tonight is to give you some base knowledge of them so that you can make informed decisions about MSAs. So how do we understand MSAs? We're going to examine the core components of a management service agreement. We're going to talk about the business rationale for the use of management service agreements. And then we'll briefly discuss some of the more common regulatory frameworks around the use of MSAs within the cannabis industry. So the core components of an MSA, there should be four categories of things that we would expect to see in every management service agreement. First and chief among those is the scope of services. This should be a detailed description of what services the management company is going to provide for you. It's going to identify their operational responsibilities. It will identify the resource allocation, and it will set performance expectations around the delivery of their services. A good MSA will also establish performance standards. There should be quantitative metrics that can be measured. There should be quality requirements. In some cases, they will identify response times around certain tasks. And obviously, we're in the cannabis industry, which I often joke. People think they're getting into the cannabis industry, but really they're getting into the compliance industry. If your management company is going to be serving some sort of compliance obligation on behalf of the company, then we would expect that to be in the performance standards as well. Fee structures are another important core component of an MSA. They often center around a set of base management fees. There may be performance incentives. Oftentimes, there will be an issue of cost recovery and reimbursement if the management company is advancing certain expenses on behalf of the company, and in some cases, even profit sharing. And finally, the last core component for the MSAs that we would expect to see is a term and termination provisions. It should establish an initial term and the length of that term. If it's subject to renewal, then we would expect to see a renewal provision. There should be triggers in the agreement that will allow for termination of the relationship. And if those triggers happen to occur, then there should be a clear set of exit procedures and how that relationship is unwound. So, what's the business rationale for using an MSA? There's quite a few of them. One being cost efficiency. There is economies of scale in hiring a management service company. If this company, for example, provides management services to a number of different companies, then the fees that they generate may actually be less expensive for you to pay than to hire staff directly to perform those same functions. That results in reduced overhead on your part. There may also be some shared resource utilization across the different companies that the management service company is serving. And there could be variable cost structures built in there. All of that could reduce your costs from your own business. MSAs also allow you to access expertise that you may not already have in your organization. Some of their best selling points is specialized knowledge, industry best practices, professional networks that they may be tied to, and also providing technology solutions for your business. A good management service company will know your industry inside and out. They will have experience managing businesses within your industry, and they will have connections and other experience that you can leverage to grow and improve your own business. MSAs or management service agreements can also allow for operational flexibility. Your services could be scalable in the sense that now you don't necessarily have to bring on additional staff to grow. A management service company can help assist with that. They also allow for further geographic expansion. If you have one location in Los Angeles, which is where all of you will likely start, and you want to open up a second location somewhere else in the state, a management service company could be really important in getting that second location off the ground, particularly since you're not boots on the ground in that area. They can provide service adaptation as your needs change. Management service companies can be very flexible about what services they provide, and they can allow for resource optimization. And then finally, one of the common functions that management service companies perform in the cannabis industry is a risk management function. Again, the ideal management service partner would be somebody with deep experience in the industry, knowledge of the regulations, knowledge of their compliance obligations. So they can perform that regulatory compliance function on behalf of your company. They can allow for operational continuity as you may decide to take different roles within the company or step back from day-to-day management of the company, and you know grow into your role as an owner. Um, they can provide a quality control function, and a good one will also provide liability mitigation, um, because they should be more on top of the managerial responsibilities than you may be yourself as a new operator coming into this industry. So what is the regulatory framework that these management service companies have to deal with? Um, Oftentimes, there are direct ownership restrictions with regard to licensing, whether it's residency requirements, background check requirements, financial interest holder disclosures, or even limitations on the number of licenses held. That sort of framework often drives operators to developing management service organizations to support other operators and collectively grow. Um, and then there's management company regulations in and of themselves. There are registration requirements. There are mandatory disclosure of MSA relationships. Prior regulatory approval may be required in some jurisdictions, and change of control notification requirements. And that might be a regulatory requirement, but that might also be a contractual requirement with your landlord, with your investors, with your lenders. If there is a change in control, it may trigger some sort of notification requirement. So that's sort of the world of regulation that these management service organizations find themselves in. So, how are management service agreements implemented? We're going to talk about the two different management styles that we often see in MSAs, as well as the common application of management service agreements. So, in terms of management style, there really is only active management and passive management. Now, active management is where that management service provider plays an integral role in the day-to-day operations of your business. They often maintain their own personnel on site at your facility, and they directly perform managerial and administrative tasks on behalf of your company. Passive management is the other version. In that case, the service provider does not play an active managerial role, but rather may provide shared services. They typically will license IP, although those things may happen in active management as well. The key point here is that they generally play a more advisory or consultative role rather than an active role. And in those situations, your business may still be required to directly hire their own management staff. So it's important to understand when you are presented with an MSA, what exactly they're offering to do. Okay. So, what are some of the common applications of MSAs? Now, it could be some or all of the things that you see on the screen here. They provide back office operations, that's administrative support, document management, facilities management and maintenance, and/or supply chain management, whether that's bringing in your inventory or bringing in other supplies that the business needs. Oftentimes it's financial management. They will provide accounting services, financial reporting. They will perform treasury functions and, and perform budget management as well. They also can perform human resources functions, whether that's recruitment of employees and contractors, whether that's administration of benefit programs on behalf of your employees, conducting training programs for your employees and staff, and monitoring performance and managing the performance of on-site staff at your business. And then finally, technology services. They may provide IT infrastructure, software management, data platforms and data security, as well as technical support for IT infrastructure that you're utilizing either on site or even in the cloud, on the web. So those services are typically provided under a management service agreement that we've been talking about. And so I think it's important that we understand some of the critical provisions that you will find in management service agreements and talk about some of the negotiation points that you're going to want to bring up as you assess a management service agreement and negotiate one with a potential service provider. We're going to look at and discuss the service specifications, the financial terms, control and oversight over the relationship, and exit strategies should you need to exit a management service agreement. Okay, so service specifications. What we would expect to see in your MSA is a detailed scope of work definition. It should include service boundaries, and I don't mean just physical boundaries, but what is the extent of the services that that company is going to provide? If there are certain exclusions from their services, that needs to be written into the agreement. If there's going to be standards around the performance of those services, that should be written in as well. And any deliverables that you expect from that company should also be identified in the agreement. Now, when we talked about performance standards being in the scope of work, there also needs to be metrics to measure that performance. Those performance metrics should be clearly identified in the agreement. It should include quantitative measures that are easily measurable, quality indicators, again, response times, and then success criteria. What does it mean to be successful? That's an important piece to see in the agreement. With regard to quality standards, the agreement should speak to industry benchmarks, compliance requirements, best practices, and expectations around customer satisfaction. And finally, with regard to deliverables, the agreement should specify specific outputs that are going to be produced by the management service organization, timelines for those outputs, your acceptance criteria for those outputs, and establish a review process so that you can determine whether or not those outputs are acceptable. With regard to financial terms, we want to see first and foremost the fee calculation method that the MSO is going to use through this management service agreement. We fully expect there to be some base fee, but will there be variable components? Is the fee adjustable based on some metric? If so, that needs to be spelled out in detail in the agreement. Does the management service company expect some sort of performance bonus? If you recall, on the last slide, we talked about defining success criteria. If that success criteria is met, is there some sort of bonus that's associated with that? If so, that should also be spelled out directly in the agreement. And then finally, cost allocations. If you're working with a company that is actively managing for your business and they have personnel on site, for example, whose obligation is it to pay those personnel? If they are performing administrative back office functions, who covers the cost associated with implementing those functions? Is it the service provider's cost, or does that cost get billed to your company? So it's important that those cost allocations make it into the agreement somewhere. Payment schedules. Every MSA should have a payment schedule. It should specify the timing for payment, what documentation is necessary to process payment, any approval process associated with that, and a dispute resolution process in case there's disagreement about how much should be paid. We talked about cost allocations a moment ago. Expense allocations are also a critical piece of MSAs. Who covers direct costs? Is there a per diem or something for overhead? Will certain expenses pass through the management service organization to your own business? And often in this industry in particular, the management service organization may take on certain capital expenditures. Is there something in the MSA that provides for their recoupment of those expenditures? How does that get wrapped up in your deal? That's a critical piece that we should talk about if any management service organization is going to cover some of your capital requirements. And finally, there should be true up provisions in the financial terms of your MSA. And when I say true up, what I mean is, how do we address fees that may be overstated or understated? What is the reconciliation process to make sure that only fees earned are what's paid? Is there an adjustment mechanism? What are the document requirements around a true up? And if there's disagreement, is there any sort of settlement procedure for that true up? I'll give you an example. Let's say that a management service organization is being paid on a percentage of gross. And at the end of a period, let's say they get a fee every quarter. At the end of the quarter, your financial reporting shows that you made a certain amount of revenue, which calculates out to a certain fee. But then after you've paid that fee, you find out a couple of weeks later, let's say, that there are actually unaccounted for losses during that same period that would write down your revenue, whether it's product returns or something along that line. Maybe it's a product recall, and that product has to come back. Well, in that case, you've just paid out management fees on more revenue than you actually generated. The fee is now overstated. How do we correct that? That's the true up provision that needs to be in your MSA, particularly if the fee calculation method is based on some sort of percentage of revenue or percentage of net. Those true up provisions can be very important. All right, control and oversight. Another very critical piece for your MSA. In the agreement, what is the governance structure? Where does decision-making authority fall? Where are approvals necessary? Are there any escalation procedures where, for example, the management company is handling day-to-day operations? At what point does a decision get escalated up to, say, a board or to the ownership? And what are the communication protocols around that? Those are important to include in the agreement. And speaking of decision-making authority, where is the dividing line? Who makes operational decisions? What if it's beyond operations and becomes more of a strategic matter? What if there is some sort of emergency action that needs to be taken? And finally, if your business is going through transition, whether it's new ownership coming in or maybe a transition to a new management company, how is that change going to be managed? And for those of you that may have some experience with management companies already, you will also recognize that information rights are critically important. What level of access will you have to your records? What will be the management service organization's reporting requirements? Will you be granted audit rights? And are there confidentiality obligations in place? With regard to audit rights, what do those provisions specify? What is the scope of an audit that you can go through? How frequently can you audit a management service organization's performance? Can you audit their cost allocation? And then if you find something in the audit, whether to your detriment or to your benefit, are there any remediation requirements? And then finally, exit strategies. In every MSA, I want to see termination rights, particularly for cause. When you hear termination for cause, I want you to think termination for bad behavior, right? If the management service company is being grossly negligent, or worse yet, they're engaging in misconduct, there needs to be a for cause termination right in your agreement. You may find some resistance to that, but it's fairly commonplace that for cause provisions are included in these agreements. Where I think you'll find more resistance is a termination right for your convenience. That will be an important negotiation point around an MSA. And whether or not you can get a termination clause for convenience will largely be dependent on your relationship with that management service company outside of the scope of them providing management services. The typical scenario is you will have a capital partner come in who is capitalizing your business and wants you to contract with their affiliated management service company. It can be very difficult to get these for convenience provisions in the MSA when the management service company is affiliated with a capital partner who wants to see you use that service provider while their capital remains in the company. It's not uncommon for there to be termination rights when there's a change in control, and also for force majeure. And if I'm sounding too much like an attorney when I say that, force majeure just means acts outside of your control, acts of God, for example. Um, Besides termination rights, we want to see transition services potentially. You may be developing a lot of information, knowledge, and data through the operation of your business. You may develop it. The management service company is certainly going to develop it through their functions. So, is there any knowledge transfer if there's a change, for example? Do they bring the next management company up to speed? If you're taking over your own management, do they bring you up to speed? How is that knowledge going to be transferred? How is data going to be migrated if you have to access your data on their platforms and move it to your own platform? How will staff be transitioned? This is very important if your service provider is engaged in active management and they have personnel on site working in your business. How will you transition to new staff if there's an exit? And will you engage in any sort of continuity planning? Right? How do we maintain the business through market up and downs, through changes in ownership, through changes in management? And speaking of ownership, how is asset ownership handled upon an exit? Does the management company bring physical assets into your operations that they're going to want back if there's an exit? How is intellectual property being held? When we're talking about customer and vendor relationships, whose relationships are those? Are they the company's relationships, or are they relationships brought by the service provider? And then who has rights in the data? Intellectual property rights can also be broken out specifically. If there is pre-existing IP that you or the MSO is bringing to the table, who owns it now that you've been sharing it? If newly created IP exists that was developed during the relationship, how is that going to be handled? How are licensing rights going to be handled? A lot of these MS management service providers come in and they might license branding to your operation. How do you transition to new branding if there's an exit? And are there going to be any restrictions on transfers of any of that intellectual property? All important things to consider and to negotiate for as you explore MSAs. So let's talk about some of the risk factors and how to prevent abuse that we've seen through MSAs. In this part of the presentation, we're going to identify and examine some of the common abuse patterns that we've seen in the industry. We're going to identify red flags for predatory behavior. And then finally, we'll discuss some of the protective measures that you can take to sort of prevent this type of abuse. All right, so common abuse patterns. Fee manipulation is a big one. Hidden charges, excessive markups, cost misallocation, and even at times we've seen double billing. These are all things to be concerned about, particularly if you're working with a network of affiliated businesses. Maybe there's a management service provider that is contracted with you to provide management services, and part of that is providing supply chain management, or what they call supply chain management, but really it's their affiliated distribution company that maybe they want you to buy your inventory from. and that distribution company may be sourcing product from their affiliated manufacturers, their affiliated cultivators. And does that create an environment where there may be excessive markups in that distribution chain, where costs may be misallocated? So that's an important thing to be on the lookout for. Another biggie is service creep. And when you hear me say service creep or service scope creep, this is where the service provider begins to perform additional services outside their contracted scope of service. Typically, these services will be unauthorized at the time, but when they perform them, they will argue that that provided some value to your business that you now have to pay for. They will often try to expand their responsibilities and their authority. And again, that may come with additional charges, and that may result in some of the resources your company has being diverted. Another common abuse in this industry, the cannabis industry, particularly with equity, is control usurpation. This is where the MSO starts running interference in your operations. They start making decisions beyond their authority. That's what we call decision overreach. They might start trying to engage in information control and limit your access to information and records of your business in an effort to cover up some of these abuse patterns. And there can also be staff manipulation. There have been incidents where service providers attempt to get staff on their side against owners of the business. Again, all things to be on the lookout for. The last two are very unique here. License misuse. This is where a service provider may try to use your license number to conduct commercial cannabis activity outside of your organization. This has resulted in product diversion, which could contribute to you losing your license. This also happens in the form of license renting or license leasing, where they allow third parties for in exchange for a fee to the management company, they will allow some third party to use your license number for their commercial cannabis operation. And all of this are examples of licensing fraud, and there could be no shortage of different ways that they might engage in licensing fraud. All right. And then also data misuse. Does anyone have unauthorized access to your data? Some of these management service providers serve multiple companies. There's a risk that they might use your data to improve a competitor. Does that result in privacy violations? Are there security breaches? These are some of the more common abuses that we've seen around data access. So what are some of the red flags that you should be on the lookout for predatory behavior here? Well, the easy one is excessive fees. If they're charging something above market rate, or the methodology for calculating the fee is super complex, or if there are hidden charges or unusual fee structures that nobody has really ever seen before, those would all be red flags that at the end of the day, your fees are going to be excessive. Another red flag is an unreasonable term length. There are management service providers who want you to agree to use them into perpetuity. This commonly comes up when your capital partner is also an affiliate of your management service provider, they will push, I promise you, to have a perpetual length term in your service agreement. And to be clear here, it may not say perpetual, but maybe the exit rights are limited or one-sided. Okay? So any sort of extended commitment beyond what's commonplace, any sort of limited exit right or automatic renewal or high termination cost could also be signs of an unreasonable length term in your agreement. I mentioned it just a second ago, but one-sided termination rights is a huge red flag of predatory behavior in these agreements. We talked about for-cause termination. If that cause definition is severely limited, then that is a one-sided termination right. If there are high penalties, if they have you pay a penalty for terminating the agreement, that's sort of a one-sided termination right. If there are complex termination procedures or unfair notice periods, it might say you need to give us 10 months notice before you can terminate the agreement. That's a one-sided termination right, and that should be a red flag in your mind as you examine these agreements. And then finally, vague performance standards. You may run into service providers who don't want performance standards at all in the agreement. That's not the right partner for you. If the metrics for evaluating the performance are undefined, that's a problem. If the criteria is subjective, that's a problem. If there's limited accountability or weak remedies in case of failed performance, that is a problem. That is a red flag that either this service provider doesn't really know what they're doing, doesn't have the expertise, or they're looking to take advantage of me. So what are some of the protective measures that we can take to prevent this sort of abuse? Well, first and foremost, we need to conduct thorough due diligence on any service provider. You need to verify them. Are they a legit company? Do they have a track record of working with other companies? Ask them for references and check those references. Do they offer you a financial analysis? Can they show you how they assisted other companies to improve their bottom line? And are they willing to submit themselves to a compliance review? Okay. In addition to that due diligence, you want to make sure that you have safeguards in your contract. That is clear definitions, clear performance standards, clear termination rights, and a process for dispute resolution. You also want to make sure that those safeguards include monitoring mechanisms, regular reviews, performance tracking, financial audits, and periodic compliance checks will put you in a position to monitor their performance and whether or not those contract safeguards are going to be meaningful. And then finally, there should always be some sort of dispute resolution procedure. If it's an escalating process from informal talks to mediation to arbitration to litigation if necessary, all of that should be spelled out in your agreement. So to conclude tonight, I want to make sure that there are a few takeaways The importance of having clear service definitions. It's critical. The need for strong governance and clear lines drawn for decision-making authority is also critical. You need to value performance monitoring, understand why that's important, and then if you do enter into one of these agreements, you need to actually perform that monitoring. And then you need to understand your risk management priorities. And those risk management strategies that you can use to meet those priorities, again, comprehensive due diligence, strong contract protections, active and ongoing monitoring, and then clear exit rights if the relationship is not working out for you. Okay? So that concludes the presentation, and I think we're ready to open it up for questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Zach. That was very informative, as always. Thanks for the useful information. But yeah, let's go ahead and jump right into the Q&A. Okay, first question. How can cannabis companies structure an MSA to protect themselves from changes in market conditions?
Okay, so that's a great question. And I'm going to get a little nuanced with my answer here.
Yeah.
One of the advantages of an MSA or working with a management service provider is that that relationship is already going to protect you from certain market conditions. Okay. It's going to offload some of your overhead expense. You can benefit from economies of scale through centralized buying if they have a number of customers that they're servicing. They may have supply chain partners that can potentially get you better deals on product. So there are some things that are germane to that management service provider relationship that can already help you when market conditions change. Now, I think maybe the substance of the question here is, what if market conditions change and I no longer see the value in this particular service, or this relationship with this particular service provider? And this is when we need to have a good exit strategy. There needs to be exit provisions in the agreement. We need to have specific performance metrics, and we have to actively monitor that performance. And we have to understand and negotiate for certain exit triggers that will allow us to terminate the relationship. If any one of those pieces is missing in the agreement, you may find it harder than necessary to get out of that relationship.
Excellent. Understood. Thank you. Next question. Can MSAs be used to structure partnerships between cannabis cultivators, manufacturers, and retailers?
That's another great question. I'm also going to get a little nuanced here and maybe sound a little bit too much like an attorney. They're not supposed to. Okay. The management service agreement is really a bilateral agreement between the service provider and the recipient business. And it's a contract for them to provide those administrative and managerial functions that we've discussed tonight. But if we step back and we think about how MSAs are often used in the industry, it's one agreement amongst a number of different agreements that may all come together in a package, particularly when you have prospective capital partners that have a number of affiliated businesses within the industry. So you may get a capital partner. For example, if you're opening up a retail store, you may get a capital partner who'll say, I'll fund the build out and the launch of your store, but I want you to use my management service company. I want you to contract with my distribution chain operation, and then their distributor that they're going to be using to inventory your store already has relationships with manufacturers and cultivators where they're sourcing product. And what that capital partner is insisting on in exchange for funding your operation is that you make a commitment to use their whole network of affiliated businesses. So those are typically not aspects that we would find in the management service agreement itself. Those agreements usually don't specify those types of partnerships, but in practice, we do see these MSAs bundled with a number of other agreements that may establish those partnerships.
Understood. And you know what? I'm going to go into this question, which I feel like kind of connects what you were just speaking of. This question's a little long. It says, a potential partner has offered to operate as my management services operator and has an agreement ready and already reviewed by their lawyer. They're stressing the time frame to have sign it. Should I have it reviewed again by another attorney before signing?
Short answer is absolutely. Do not rely on your prospective partner's legal counsel to provide you legal advice on that agreement. And I would invite everybody to go back and take a look at the predatory partnership presentation where we warned against this exact thing. Um, any partner who is stressing time frame as a reason for why you don't need to go get your own independent legal counsel is likely prepared to engage in predatory behavior. Do not rush into anything because a partner is stressing the urgency of time at to the detriment of you being able to go out and get your own professional advice around an agreement. So in short, absolutely get your own legal review. But the more nuanced point here is if you find yourself in that situation, that is one of the red flags that we've talked about previously to be on the lookout for. That may not be the right partner for you.
Thank you, Zach. And kind of along those lines as well. And you did touch on this during the presentation, but I figured I'd ask this during the Q&A. What common mistakes should cannabis businesses avoid when entering into an MSA?
So there's a lot of them. Some of them we've just touched on here, rushing into it without getting separate advice. Um, Entering into an MSA as a part of a bundle or package of agreements without understanding the implication of how those different agreements may work together and how those different obligations may rise up. In the MSA itself, not accounting for clear definitions, not accounting for clear performance metrics and measuring standards, not having exit provisions, right? Not having termination rights or other certain information rights, not understanding the financial terms and their impact on you and your business. And then even if you have an MSA that passes muster, right? There is an ongoing need to monitor and to assess the performance of that service provider. You could have the best contract in the world, but if you're not actively engaged in monitoring and being involved, then you never know what's going to happen, right? And it may be too late to fix things.
Excellent. Thank you, Zach. Let's see. Next question. Here we go. Do MSAs play a role in ensuring compliance with cannabis-specific regulations, like licensing or taxation?
They absolutely should, especially if some sort of compliance obligation is part of that management company's scope of work. So oftentimes, if in this industry, a company that is contracted with a service provider, that service provider may be the one contacting the DCC when the license is up for renewal. If there are any inspections that are conducted on premise, they may be intimately involved with that. And then again, particularly with those providers that are actively in management, they may be performing those functions on your behalf on site. And so there's a huge compliance role for those sorts of service providers. But even the more passive service providers, they may be the ones who are developing your standard operating procedures. They may be the ones that are developing your employee manuals. They may be the ones who are developing your operating strategy. And all of those things have compliance obligations tied to them. So even if they're just advisory or consultative, they may be passing off material to you that you're going to implement in your operation that may impact your compliance.
Understood. Thank you, Zach. And one last question. Are there any state-specific regulations that businesses need to be aware of when entering into an MSA?
Yes, absolutely. The state of California requires you to disclose any financial interest holder and anybody with operational control over your licensed operations. Management service organizations often fall into both of those buckets. If they are being paid on a percentage basis, they are a financial interest holder. And potentially, if their fees are high enough, that could trigger and make them an owner for purposes of licensing. Not necessarily a legal owner, but an owner for purpose of licensing, meaning that people in their organization have to get live scanned and pass a background check as well. And then obviously, if they're managing the company on your behalf in some sort of active basis, then that needs to be disclosed to the DCC as well.
Understood. Excellent. Well, thank you, Zachary. We appreciate your time. Once again, as always, great job. Very informative. Can't wait till this gets put up on the LMS so people can, rewatch it and absorb it.
Thank
So
you
thank
so
you
much. I'm
again.
happy to be of assistance.
Excellent. Thank you. And we hope that you all out there watching found this webinar on management service agreements helpful and informative. For any questions, please contact us at dcr.sep@lacity.org, dcrlicensing@lacity.org, or contact your licensing analyst directly. Thank you and good night.